wanted to expand on something I said last time about the analogy between Cubs fans and black Republicans. Thinking about it more in relation to Alexis de Tocqueville's famous fear when he was analyzing America's fledgling democracy. As a European, he was at the same time, hopeful, enthusiastic about the possibilities of democracy, and yet wary of what he called the tyranny of the majority. And what I think this concern boils down to is that in a democracy where majority rules, when that majority also becomes the privileged class, as opposed to, say, in Europe, where the privileged class was reserved for the few, the aristocrats, once the majority becomes the privileged class, that tyranny becomes all the more oppressive. And that's essentially what happens with Cubs fans. They are typically, the part of the more socioeconomically advantaged classes, and they become, drunk with their own power, and their behavior follows accordingly. And I see something similarly with black Republicans that, as I mentioned, I think is especially distasteful because it's a kind of rejection. To use a strong, historically loaded term. It's kind of being an Uncle Tom. You're rejecting where you came from because you want to be part of that privileged group. So just like black Cub fans, black Republicans are kind of turning their back on their people, so to speak. And I know this is harsh, and not being black myself, I'm sure I'll probably get some flack from some African Americans saying, who the hell is he to make pronouncements like this? Maybe playing Public Enemy in the background will mitigate that to some extent, but you're saying, well, I want to be part of the privileged class too. In fact, I am. Through hard work, I've risen above my beginnings, and everyone else should be able to do that. And so this idea of becoming part of the privileged class, I think, leads to this kind of, this attitude almost of self-righteous entitlement. You see this, in the current black Republican presidential candidate. I forgot his name. To me, he's just like Herman Cain was. Another kind of token gesture by Republicans who can alleviate their white guilt by embracing a black man who represents all their same values and has that same kind of attitudes that are often, not all the times, but often rooted in racism, where they say, well, poor black people, they should be able to rise above as well. They could be like this man, this neurosurgeon. And granted, that's a great achievement. But at the same time, the material reality is that most people are in, if you're poor, it is hard as hell to break out of that cycle. And most people who have this attitude have never been poor. So they don't know how hard it is to rise above it. And so it's easy for them to say, well, anyone who's poor should be able to rise above it. It's not. It doesn't work like that. Makes me think also of the greatness of someone like Martin Luther King. I think Tavis Smiley said that he's the greatest American that our country has ever produced, and I would agree with him because here is a man who rose above the racism of that time, that era. It makes racism today, which is still pronounced and bad, but it makes racism today look like nothing. I think Chris Rock said something funny one time about, differences in racism from one time to another, saying that, I can't remember exactly how he said it. Obviously, he's much funnier than anything I could say to capture that, but something to the effect that, instead of having someone, driving the horse or the car nowadays who's black, back in the day, he was the horse, and so you can't even compare. Still, racism is alive and well today. All the shootings of unarmed black men confirm this. But someone like Martin Luther King, who suffered under extreme racism, was able to rise above it, and despite being part of the minority, both, literally in terms of race and also in terms of power, economic power, He was able to convince people that there's something fundamentally unjust and wrong with the system as it is, and he was able to transform society through reason and nonviolence, and that is an incredible accomplishment. And so, and in contrast, the Occupy movement of a few years ago, which I knew was doomed to fizzle out. But the problem was the majority of the people who constituted that movement, they weren't part of that socioeconomic minority. They were, college students, privileged, like tree-hugging hippies who like to beat the drums and talk a good game. But when it's all said and done, they could just go home and live their lives of comfort. There wasn't enough riding on the movement for it to gain steam because they were too comfortable, And so it's easy for us to kind of, forget about those who don't have any type of representation, any type of voice, because they are part of this minority. Look at our criminal justice system, where we can just store away millions of black and brown men, and no one gives a crap about how bad their plight is, because they're part of the minority. And it's easy for people to just say, well, they deserve that, they did something bad, not realizing that what breeds crime is poverty. And if you have a social system where people are trapped in poverty, of course you're going to have crime. Right? Not to excuse it, especially violent crime, but our criminal justice system is clearly, everyone can agree on this, there's something wrong with it. And the harsher it gets, the worse it gets. But it's easy to forget about these people because we can just write them off because they don't matter. They're part of the minority, not only literally in terms of race, but also socioeconomically. And unless you know someone personally who's in jail, in prison, then you don't have anything invested in it. And so you don't care that they have to pay, $20 per phone call, or that they have these sentences where even if they are able to get through 5 or 10 years for a burglary or something like that, then they have no prospects when they're done. And the racism behind this is just so obvious, and yet at the same time, people are quick to dismiss that component. Not everybody, obviously. There are people who recognize this and are trying to do something, but no one cares enough. And my final little point is that this idea of reverse racism to me is just utterly ridiculous, because racism is also a function of socioeconomic power. And so for a white person to feel discriminated against in the U.S. just does not make sense, because they're not part of that minority who doesn't have a voice, generally speaking, right? Even like poor white trash, to use that derogatory term, being white, they still have a privilege that black people just don't have, And so this is just this idea of reverse racism to me is just doesn't make sense. So this goes back to Cub fans and why I think, they're so distasteful. Or to put it simply, Cubs fans suck, because they relish being part of that majority, part of the oppressive herd. And so when I see a black Cub fan, or even one of my own, Asian brothers or sisters wearing Cub gear, my heart sinks. I'm like, what? You gotta fight the power. And props to President Obama, Sox fan. All right, that's it. Thanks. Bye.